principle that Haidt introduces is motivated moral reasoning. Here, the idea is that moral reasoning should be expected to be more like prosecuting someone, like being a lawyer, than like being an impartial scientist. This view aligns with the noted saying from William James, thinking is for doing. This proposal that humans' moral reasoning is not based upon some shared idea of moral truths has been supported by many studies in moral psychology. These studies show that judgments we'd expect to be consistent across individuals, like assessment of cause and effect, or whether someone was intentional or not, or how to assign blameworthiness for harming a person. These are often shaped by our concerns about fitting in with our groups because, as Haidt notes, we live in a reputation-obsessed community. It's been proposed that there are two main pathways for motivated moral reasoning. Our communities and our concerns about our reputations in our communities directly affect how we view other people's moral accountability. For example, we might believe my mother could not possibly have meant to hurt them. She was provoked or tired, or it's just a product of her generation. Motivational forces also lead us to apply our moral principles differently based on irrelevant factors. For example, we might believe in the principle of do no harm, but we might think the person who was rude to us that one time got what they deserved when someone was rude to them. Haidt emphasizes the self-advocating features of human cognition and how they're factoring into our moral judgments in this principle. And it's important to think about how pressures faced by individuals in their communities affect morality, including pressures at the implicit level. Like how being related to someone or friends with someone can change how we think about them being held accountable for something. And it can even change whether we judge their action as wrong at all, because our principles can go out the window. We're going to look at lots of ways that we humans demonstrate motivated moral reasoning in later lectures. At this point, we can take note of the fact that the phenomenon is part of Haidt's empirical toolbox and has influenced a lot of research in moral psychology. The third principle that Haidt follows when he argues that we must be broadening the moral domain is that morality does not function for the individual. It functions in important ways for the group. Primarily, he focuses on how people make enormous sacrifices for each other. And crucially, these sacrifices, some of them we make for strangers and other people in our groups we'll never see again. So they can't be explained by kin selection, that genes for altruism evolved to target kin, and those moral behaviors can't be explained by reciprocal altruism, the idea that genes for altruism evolved targeting altruism at people who did us a favor, and vengeance at those who do not return favors. Ultimately, there's a world of moral behavior that doesn't clearly fit with individualistic models. It's the care that we do for unrelated people, including children and elders who can't repay us, and other strangers who we'll never see again. Haidt proposes that this can be explained by moral communities engaging in systems of indirect reciprocity. And this is when you maintain a good reputation as a moral person, this pays off. It increases the odds of eliciting favors in the future. In this system, morality works for group solidarity. It reinforces particular behaviors. Virtue is rewarded and selfishness is punished by the group. Now, if morality is for the group, according to Haidt, this suggests that morally bad acts are not just those that hurt an individual or cheat an individual out of something they deserve, or violate individual rights. Instead, in Haidt's original fourth proposal here, he says that morality can stretch beyond harm and fairness. Moral communities make use of what he calls a tribal overlay. It's a group-oriented overlay on their moral concerns about harm and injustice. So what does this overlay look like? First, centrally, people are typically most concerned about harm and fairness. But in addition to harm and fairness concerns, people care about loyalty. There are widespread intuitions about the importance of in-group, out-group boundaries, and the importance of not crossing those lines to betray your group. Also not fitting into the categories of a concern about harm or fairness, people have strong intuitions that it's right and good and moral to respect authority and to be obedient as opposed to pushing your own views or going your own way. In addition, moral concern about purity is for some people a major aspect of their moral worldview. What is right and good does not desecrate purity, offend God, violate chastity rules, doesn't cause disgusting or unnatural outcomes. This is a moral concern about purity and sanctity that can't be captured by a concern about harm. Together, these moral foundations, added to harm and fairness, represent moral concerns that are relevant to group-level functioning. Weaving together the theory and findings of these four principles, Haidt calls for a new definition of the moral domain. It's based on this newfound diversity of moral values that defines the moral domain by function. This is a functionalist definition, and we also saw that Noren Zion adopted it as his operationalization of morality. Moral systems are interlocking sets of values, virtues, norms, practices, identities, institutions, technologies, and evolved psychological mechanisms that work together to suppress or regulate selfishness and make social life possible. An advantage Haidt proposes his functional approach has over a content-based definition of morality is that it forces us to look beyond individual minds and psychological mechanisms. Compare this model to the stage model of Kohlberg or Turiel's focus on the content of moral transgressions. Haidt's model has forced a look at the social influences on morality. What this model also lets us do is recognize a wider variety of societies as moral systems. If morality is not just about harm or unfairness, we might examine normatively immoral systems such as patriarchies, group-based moralities, purity values as part of moral systems and defer from making normative judgments of them. We can attempt to deconstruct them empirically as people's moral systems nonetheless. How can we measure moral systems in this new way when previously harm and fairness violations were all that qualified as morally relevant? Graham and colleagues present a massive validation of their instrument for measuring these values, the Moral Foundations Questionnaire, the MFQ. The MFQ examines the extent to which people endorse the moral values in the foundations outside harm and fairness, including harm and fairness. The MFQ is a measure to the degree to which people endorse harm, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity values. Jesse Graham, who spearheaded all the development of this measure, notes that we sometimes say that a person scored high on a particular foundation. That's a shorthand way of saying that their morality, as we measure it, relies heavily on virtues and concepts related to that foundation. Let's look at this instrument. To assess caring and fairness values, they give participants several items that include items like these: How much do you agree or disagree? One of the worst things a person could do is hurt a defenseless animal. When the government makes laws, the number one principle should be ensuring that everyone is treated fairly. Participants would give their response using Likert scales. Caring and fairness values involve protecting individual rights to be unharmed and treated as an equal. Caring and fairness values have been deemed the individualizing values by moral foundations theory. And this is because they are to be extended to each individual, regardless of group membership. Some people are also very concerned about other kinds of violations, including whether someone failed to stand by their partner or team member, whether someone disobeyed authority or was unchaste. Prohibiting these sorts of behaviors reflects the moral values of loyalty, obedience, and purity. These values help preserve relationships. They keep groups together. They're not focused on individuals, and they're known as the binding values. They're measured by the MFQ with questions like, how much do you agree or disagree? It's more important to be a team player than to express oneself. If I were a soldier and disagreed with my commanding officer's orders, I would obey anyway, because that is my duty. I would call some acts wrong on the grounds that they are unnatural. Participants' responses to questions like these were made into a score for each of those values: loyalty, obedience, and purity, which collectively are the binding values. While Graham and colleagues contend that their analyses ultimately produce these 5 moral foundations, their model can also be said to produce 2 overarching factors: individualizing values and binding values.